So, to start with, why bother? Why do we even talk about cell theory? Perhaps my most disappointing question from grade 10, 11 and 12 biology classes. Why do we even look at cells at all? And the answer is because they are everything. And this is a beautiful quote from E.B. Wilson, who says, "The key to every biological problem must finally be sought in the cell. For every living organism is, or at some time has been, a cell." And he's so right. The key to so much of the biology that we interact with is the cell, either its functions, its processes, or the multicellular organisms that you and I represent, and how we interact, and all those processes at core are the cell, are an understanding of cell biology and how cells function. And that's why I have chosen to add this absolutely beautiful image. And that image, as you can see where I put the little comment there, is of red blood cells in the end of a needle. And I think that's so representative because that's showing us that this substance, blood, this liquid that we see when we've hurt ourselves is actually not just a liquid, it's literally parts of you and me. So when you are bleeding, those little parts of us are being lost. And it's those particles that make up every aspect of who you are. And that's fantastic. And so I really, really love that image because it really is almost a little bit shocking to see that those little particles are what makes up blood. The second one down here is moss leaf cells. And I think, again, firstly, this is a beautiful image. Just the greenness of it is a fantastic image. But the other thing is what you're seeing here is that plants and all those organisms that you see all the time, down to blades of grass, which you're seeing absolutely every day, are made up of these little units called cells. And those billions of cells interacting together, supporting each other with their structures, their internal structures, like in this case, the green chloroplasts, are continuously working to make multi-cellular organisms like us, as well as single cellular organisms, function and live. And I think this is a fantastic image also because even a young kid in a simple classroom who can have access to a microscope can see an image just like that, just from a piece of onion, which is just such a fantastic idea. And so, why do we study biology and why do we study cells? And the answer is because cells are us. We are trillions of cells working together to make the massive, amazing, functioning multicellular organism that we are, and that our understanding of that is so core to medicine, to our understanding of our behavior and the behavior of other organisms around us, and the functioning of so many aspects of the living world. So, if cells are literally us, which they are, then they are also who we are. So they are our behaviors, they are why we interact, they are why we make the decisions we make, and why we get sick, and all those kinds of things. And that's why it's really important that we understand deeply within our science, we deeply understand the biology of cells. Now, I've just put a little quick note in here just to remind me and remind you that this topic is not just something that I'm giving you now and the core to the biology section here just because I think it's important. This topic is important through Queensland, Australian and international curriculum on so many levels. And you will, when you went to school, you will have looked at cell biology. You may not remember a lot of it, but you will have looked at cell biology because it is so significant and it runs all the way through to grade 12. And it builds. So by the time a student is in grade 12 or grade 11 and they're doing genetics, which I've just done with my grade 11s just recently, by the time they've done genetics, they have had to build towards that. If they are dumped with genetics without any understanding of cell biology, without the understanding of the structures, without understanding of how cells interact, how they divide, etc., then that genetics section is almost useless. So this is a really important building process towards the biology of cells, and then from there into genetics and our understanding of genetics. And so it's a key that runs all the way down through and is sequenced all the way down through the learning of science in primary and then in high schools. Okay, so let's get to the core of this. Let's talk about cell theory. Our first biological theory is going to be cell theory. The premise of cell theory is that all living things are made of simple living units called cells. Now, there is 4 basic tenets, we'll call them, or principles of cell theory, and they are: 1, all living things are composed of cells and cell products. So all the living things you've ever interacted with, all the grass you've ever seen, all the massive trees you've ever seen, all the whales, all the jellyfish, all of these living organisms are composed of cells or cell products. The second one is that new cells are formed by the division of pre-existing cells, and that's really important as well. So you can see the diagram just here. This is 2 cells dividing, and you can see they've separated. These are what's referred to as daughter cells, and they should be identical to each other. In fact, you and the organism you are today is a consequence of the continued division of cells from the very first fertilized egg cell that was in your mother's uterus. And this continuous division of those cells has built to the multicellular organism that you are today. And the vast majority of the cells that you are today were not your cells even when you were born. So you are continuing to change, and your cells are continuing to divide, and they're dividing in you right now. So the second one, the division of pre-existing cells, is the second of those principles, those tenets. The third one down here is that a cell contains the inherited information, genes, used as the instructions for growth, functioning, and development. So this is the picture I've kind of put with it. This is that cells contain a blueprint, and that blueprint is what we call genes, and the molecule is DNA. So all cells, including you, and the cells that make you up, inherited the information that allowed them to build, that allows them to function right now, and makes your identity both as your identity on a macro scale and your identity on a micro scale. And it all comes from that, from DNA molecule. So the blueprint of life in the form of chromosomes. So you would have seen chromosomes as kind of X-shaped chromosomes. And organisms, all living organisms today use DNA of one form or another. And last but not least, the cell is the functioning unit of life. All the chemical reactions of life take place within the cell. Now, of course, there is some variation in this, and we're going to talk about it between single cellular organisms and multicellular organisms. But the fourth tenet is that the cell is the functioning unit of life, and that they are semi-independent in the sense that they function through all those processes themselves. Okay, so you've got your 4 tenets. Now we're just going to quickly continue to talk quickly about cells as the basic unit of structure and function of living things, and we're just going to go into it a little bit more. So each cell can be thought of as a more or less autonomous unit. Autonomous in that it's slightly independent. Now, of course, in multicellular organisms, some cells specialize in different functions. Specific tissues have different functions, and they work together. So it's arguable that, of course, those tissues taken out of the body and the supporting systems are not going to function, and they're going to die. And that's exactly what happens when, you know, a piece of your finger is cut off. Those cells don't exactly live independently. However, they are semi-autonomous in terms of a lot of their processing. Okay, they take in nutrients and chemical energy, and they expel waste products. So each cell in your body must access nutrients and chemical energy. The oxygen that you're taking in through your lungs must use your circuitry system to eventually make its way to all your cells. And if it doesn't, those cells die. So they are autonomous, however, they require that support. And that's why you have different functioning systems in your body to provide the support to cells that might otherwise not be able to gain it themselves. So nutrients and chemical energy is coming in, and they're expelling waste, which is, of course, your circuitry system as well. And it's reliant on complex, often catalyzed reactions occurring within the cell. Now, you've hopefully talked a little bit about catalyzed reactions, And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Basically, what happens is that in your cells, in order for reactions to happen fast enough to support your cells, and particularly specialist cells, they're catalyzed. And the catalyzation process is reinforced and initiated often by enzymes. And we're going to get into enzymes a little bit later. Now, the final section here is what I was talking about at the beginning, which is just that multicellular organisms, each cell has a job that contributes to the health of the greater organism, and we'll hopefully get into and talk about that a little bit more later. Now, I just wanted to give you a little list of the basic needs of a cell. All cells share 4 basic needs. Obviously, you could argue that there are others, but 4 basic needs. They need to be separated internally and externally from their environment, for which they use a plasma membrane, and we're going to talk about plasma membranes, and they might use a cell wall as well to harden that separation. They store information and pass it on to the next generation, so that's that DNA which we talked about, and they read DNA and the code and they turn it into functional proteins that can be used both internally within the cell and to communicate with other cells. And they conduct chemical processes of life. So ingesting food and energy, and of course, metabolic processes like respiration and growth, and the expelling of waste. So, functions of life. They need nutrition, they need to obtain food to provide energy and the material needed for growth. They need to metabolize, they need chemical reactions inside the cell, including cell respiration to release energy. So they need to take that food that they've accessed and brought inside themselves, and they need to break it down and they need to turn it into functional energy that they can then use to grow, to expand, to move, etc. Life needs, of course, growth. So this might be replication and the formation of new individuals, but it's also growth in size. The response ability as well, obviously all life needs to respond to its surroundings, to respond to its environment. It needs to excrete, so it needs to get rid of the waste products. So when it's metabolizing, when it goes to respiration, the waste products like carbon dioxide need to be dumped, they need to be got rid of. And that's really vital because otherwise it can wreck the functionality of those really important life chemistry processes. And this one here is homeostasis. That's just keeping conditions inside the organism within a tolerable range. Now that, of course, is temperature. The example, of course, is that if you are cold, eventually, if you're too cold for too long, your cells stop functioning, and that's when you die. The same is true of overheating as well. So fevers, for instance, at too high a temperature for too long can disassociate proteins, can break down proteins. They can also, and consequently, they can destroy the enzymes that allow your body and your cells to function. So of course, homeostasis, which is evenness, the keeping of evenness of temperature and the environment within your cells and around your cells is really important. Reproduction, of course, the reoccurring reproduction of new organisms and the production of offspring is obviously really vital as well. Okay, so cells, finally, we're just going to get down to the end here. We're going to talk about cell variation. So cells vary in size and hugely. Most cells are between 1 and 100 micrometers and visible only using a microscope. Now, there are some special exceptions to this. There are some ginormous cells that you can see with a naked eye, but the vast majority of cells are quite small, and you're going to need a microscope to have a look at them. Cell size is very diverse. A range of cells is shown to illustrate this idea, and I'm just going to show you some of those range of size of cells. And I popped in a virus in there so that you can compare it with the size of a virus. So what you can see here, right at the top there, is the cell from a flowering plant. And they're quite large cells. You may have seen those when you've cut open an onion in school and you've had a look down the microscope and you've seen those big boxy plant cells, and they are pretty big. So you can't see them with a naked eye really, but you can certainly see them very well through a microscope. The next one down over here is a human white blood cell. You can see comparatively smaller than the plant cell, but it is again, relatively large compared to some of the others. So these are all eukaryotic. We're going to talk about the eukaryotic cells. And then back down over here, we have a small prokaryotic cell, a bacteria cell. And these, as you can see, are 2 to 10 micrometers, so considerably smaller than the relatively large eukaryotic cells. And finally, last but not least, that little black dot in the circle over there is representing this, which is a virus, which is really a non-living thing and is reliant on parasitizing your cells or other cells in order to replicate, and they are absolutely tiny as a consequence. I've got another, I think, beautiful image here that I think shows that variation in size. Now, I won't spend too much time on it, but you can see at this end, you've got a leaf at 10 millimeters. You then go down to looking down at a cut through of the leaf at kind of 1 millimeter, because this is obviously logarithmic. And then when you go down into that cut through and have a look at 100 micrometers, you're looking at a plant cell. You go from there to an animal cell. Within the cell, the animal cell, if you're looking even closer, you're seeing some organelles for cells, so the parts of cells. You're looking at nucleus, the Golgi apparatus, and the tiny little organelle, which is so important to the production of proteins, which is the ribosome there. And then you've got the chemical structures of the cell membrane, which is the plasma membrane. And at the far end over here, you have this amazing molecule, which is DNA. Now, finally, I just wanted to show you some quick notes about how we can use units in scientific classrooms. And that's all this slide is about. All I'm trying to say in this slide is just to say to you that, that numeracy is absolutely vital. Comparing sizes is a numeracy skill, and you can use this in biological contexts and biological lessons and scientific lessons all the time. And you can use scientific lessons to work on numeracy, and we do at high school all the time, and you should do. It's really important that when you're sitting in a scientific classroom and you're discussing science with students, you do not feel guilty getting bogged into the maths that's occurring in that scientific process. You absolutely commit to it. You do not feel guilty with that, because that investment in maths within a scientific context is just as important as the science content that you're covering. So when you have an opportunity to use it, make it valid, make it practical, make it relevant in the scientific process, certainly do that. Absolutely commit to it, whether it's looking at graphing and understanding graphing and reading graphs and responding to them, whether it's measuring objects and comparing measurements of objects, all absolutely relevant. Whether you're running quadrats, whether you're running transects, whether you're measuring temperature, all of those things have practical relevance both in a scientific context and in a mathematical and numerical context in the numeracy of a classroom. It's really important as a science teacher that you realize that these two things are absolutely interlinked, and that you should not feel guilty to spend some time having a look at them and investing energy into getting students that understand the mathematical and numeracy basis for so much of science. And so that's why I put this little teacher's note up there, just to say the integration of numeracy concepts into the scientific classroom is vital and should be a focus, particularly during practical activities. Cells and biological topics in general provide an excellent opportunity to integrate numeracy into lessons. This can be as simple as comparative size or the units of measurement. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of this little lecture. I've just popped in some research that you could be having a look at about cell size and cell history and cell theory, because I think that is the success criteria from this lecture. And finally, I've just popped in what I think is a fantastic image and is showing you bacteria cells right on the end of a pinhead, just to give you a bit of an idea about exactly how small bacteria cells are and how many of them there are around you all the time. Thank you very much.